Alright, hello everyone. Let me just get everything configured properly here. There we go. Is this working now? I see we only have about just a couple of viewers this afternoon, 12:01. Let me know if the audio is working out. I'm just getting the slides set up here so we can be ready to start. Justina, thank you. Yes, the audio is working. Alright, so welcome to today's live stream for COMM. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box as usual. Of course, this video will be saved on YouTube, so if you're not watching live, you can always watch it a bit later. Today we're going to be talking about the readings assigned for today on disability. They focus on disability in communication as a kind of intercultural communication. And I also have some short slides on working in teams and assuming a leadership role in a team. Now, these slides, of course, were geared towards the early version of the class where you were expected to do some group work when you would come together and make group presentations. Of course, group presentations have been canceled and replaced with individual presentation assignments. So I've shortened these slides a little bit, but I think they're still useful. So we're going to work our way through these slides as well. I hope to be done in about an hour. So thanks for logging on and watching with me. Again, I'm watching that chat box. Ask me any questions, stop me at any time, or send me an email. How's everyone doing out there? We're into what, week 3 of social distancing? Is everybody holding out okay? So I have 2 kids in here in the house, working from home, but it's working out okay. So stay safe, stay healthy. I got a random sore throat from something. It's easy to be paranoid right now. So I'm live streaming today. There's a bit of a delay. I'm watching that chat box. I set up a survey online on FOL. Now this survey is asking whether you would prefer continuing on YouTube, live streaming like this, or whether next week we should transition for the last 3 classes to a different format. The options are continuing on YouTube using the Bongo Virtual Classroom app, which is integrated into FOL. Using Zoom, I know some professors have switched to Zoom. Or finally, kind of a last candidate, the Twitch streaming service. So if you have a preference there, go to the survey. A few students have answered the survey, but not that many yet, so I didn't want to change things before I had more students answering that survey. But if you do want to switch services, answer that poll. But for today, just for today, I'm going to just do the live stream. And then next week we'll see. I'll announce the results and set things up. So just a quick reminder of our new assignment schedule. Right, your case study assignment was due on Friday. I haven't read them yet. They were due March 29th. I have quite the backlog of grading right now, but I'm trying very hard to catch up. And I will be grading your case study assignments soon. This week, nothing is due. However, April 12th, your research reports should be coming in now. Your research reports, of course, are about diversity in London, Ontario. So you are presenting a report as if you're presenting it to, say, the London Chamber of Commerce. You're presenting it to local businesses just to give people information about diversity in London. Probably everyone has started that already. So keep working on that research report, because you're going to be turning that research report into a short individual presentation before the end of the semester. That's April 24th. You have some options here for the individual presentation. I want to see some slides. We talked about slides last week, but I also need to see either a screen capture where you kind of talk your way through your presentation. You can also use your smartphone and take a video of your presentation, or you can finally write a short script, which would be like your narration, what you would have said if you are actually presenting. So those are your three options to accompany your slides. You have to do one of those three to get full marks. Next week, I'll be talking in some more detail about the research report and presentation. I want to go over the rubric. And I want to talk a little bit about time management, setting up a useful workflow. So that'll be next week. Nada says, I think virtual classroom, because the rest of our class are on there. It's easy to communicate. We could talk through the mic if anybody has a question. All right. I've heard good things about the virtual classroom. I've never used it. But I think, yeah, the people that have voted so far, I think we had a slight preference for the virtual classroom as opposed to YouTube. So maybe next week we'll do that. We'll see how the votes go. It's something I've never done, but I'm very familiar with YouTube, so I went with what I was comfortable with, because, of course, nobody expected having to transition entirely online. This kind of came out of nowhere. And, of course, so we have case studies, reports, presentations, and forums. I think the Disability Week 11 forum is now open. So, speaking of this week, right, we have two readings, one from the textbook. It's called Which is My Good Leg? Cultural Communication, Persons with Disabilities. And I linked an article from the Harvard Business Review called The Case for Improving Work for People with Disabilities. There's a very soft paywall on that article. If they're cutting off the article and you can't read it, open it in an incognito window or disable your ad blocker. You should be able to see that ad. See that article if you have your ads on. After that, talking a little bit about teamwork, leadership, and people skills. So let's talk about these readings on disability. For those of you who have done the reading, maybe you can type in a little comment here. Tell me what you thought. Let me know if anything resonated with you. A lot of things did for me, because disability could mean a whole lot of things. Right? The examples in the reading often go back to very visible disabilities. You know, being in a wheelchair after an accident. It can also mean being congenitally blind or being hard of hearing. But there's all kinds of invisible disabilities as well. You know, they could be related to mental health, for example. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that as well. So again, I'll be keeping an eye on that chat box. Let me know if anything in those readings really kind of spoke to you. Now the article kind of opens, the opening hook of the article is a few kind of illustrative stories about social interaction, communication, and disability. All right, so we have three stories. The first one is this young man, Jonathan. He's in a wheelchair, and he's just being completely ignored by a waiter in a restaurant. Instead, his date is, you know, the one the waiter keeps talking to his date. You know, the waiter ignores the guy and basically just acts as if either he wasn't there or would be unable to answer for himself. But of course, just because you're in a wheelchair doesn't mean anything about whether or not you're able to be at a restaurant. So there's clearly some prejudice here in this story. Kim describes how people invade her space, sometimes even push her wheelchair without consent. And finally, Jeff, who's not disabled, but used this really common expression, hey, let's go run off somewhere. And he felt kind of mortified because Helen's in a wheelchair and can't run. But Helen didn't actually mind. It's a very common expression. So in the first two scenarios, people were being kind of paternalistic, relying on stereotypes. And in the last one, Jeff was just being oversensitive. So what we're going to try to... So I think the moral of these three stories is that you shouldn't go on either extreme here. You shouldn't either be paternalistic and judgmental, but also don't be too sensitive. Just act normal. Um, and these stories kind of lead into the article's short discussion of the American with Disabilities Act, which is a piece of U.S. legislation that was passed in 1990. So we're looking at 30 years ago. The legislation, prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. It means jobs, schools, transportation, any public and private places that are open to the general public can't discriminate against individuals with disabilities. And more people today live with a disability. Part of that is longer life expectancy and improved medical care. So things that 40, 50 years ago meant that you might not survive at all are now just things you live with. And that's good news. And secondly, it's a very important shift, and I don't think people realize how significant this shift is in the kind of second half of the 20th century when it began, is that disability is just more integrated into public life. There was a time where people would stay at home or be institutionalized for even mild disabilities, from Down syndrome to cerebral palsy to more serious things. And we've realized now that people can really lead normal lives outside of, despite quote unquote disability. So we have to kind of rethink our approach to disability here. That was a very big kind of a paradigm shift. So when we're thinking about communication around disability, the textbook suggests just think of it as another kind of intercultural communication. So they have the story of Mary, a college student who was paralyzed after diving into a swimming pool. Said her quote, "Look, I knew there were disabled people around, but I never thought it could happen to me. Before this happened, I saw a person in a wheelchair. I would have been uncomfortable. I didn't know what to say." So discomfort can be a common reaction in communication between disabled and quote unquote able people. And these reactions can happen in many different ways, right? We can act in a paternalistic way, and by paternalistic just means that you're treating someone like a child. Paternalistic is from the Latin word for father. So like the people who decided to push Kim's wheelchair around, that's very paternalistic. You're treating this adult human being like a child. And that's really, really wrong. Or on the other hand, you could be really oversensitive, right? Like Jeff, who made this innocuous remark. So people are dealing with their discomfort by, in a way, overreacting in one direction or another. But the reality is, you should probably start by acting normal. So the book, as I've been saying, suggests thinking of communication across disability as a kind of intercultural communication, because ability and disability creates its own culture, right? There's such a thing as, for example, deaf culture. There's a nice example I found on the internet here: 15 things only wheelchair users would understand. Why? Because if you're a wheelchair user, you have these kind of common reference points, right? So the textbook says, quote, "Becoming disabled is similar to assimilating from being a member of a non-disabled majority to being a member of a minority group," right? So you kind of become enculturated, if you think about our readings from a few weeks ago, into this new culture. Let's look at this link because it's actually kind of funny. Let's hope it loads. There's 15 things only wheelchair users would understand. So if you are in a wheelchair for a period of time, you might notice people staring at you. You may begin to feel like you're famous. People are always like, like I'm just a regular person. Something you might not notice unless you're on a wheelchair is, let's just block my notifications here, elevators are somehow always far away. My life is full of ramps. Look at the 1 and 2 and 3. Oh, another ramp. Right? People hogging handicap spots when they're not supposed to. Always, everything you need at the grocery store is on the top shelf. You always have to be telling your story. A little bit of discomfort about using the term going for a walk. People always asking you if help is needed. Like, yeah, do I need help? Yeah. Feeling separated from your friends, right? Especially true when you go to a concert or a live show. Having to skip private parties, right? Because most people have stairs in their house. You know every crack in the sidewalk. There's a war at the bus stop. San Francisco with the hills is a workout. Inaccessible bathrooms. And people apparently pat you on the head. What is... So... So I guess if you were in a wheelchair, right, this probably would be kind of hilarious because it's these common reference points. There's stuff I would never have thought about, right? Like uh, really memorizing cracks in the sidewalk or how difficult bus stops can be. But once you're in this situation, you share these common reference points with everyone else who is in a wheelchair or everyone else who shares whatever your disability is. And then as a result, it kind of does create a culture. Um, so how do we think our way through this? Well, we can use all the tools we've developed in the rest of the semester to just think about how we should approach communication across disability. Um, and one of the ways we can do this is ourselves rethink what ability and disability even means. Because the book does a number of nice distinctions. One of the things it does is it kind of distinguishes between a handicap and a disability. Because disability is really just a limitation that a person can overcome or compensate using some device, some means, training, occupational therapy. And a disability only is a handicap when the physical environment, the social environment around you makes it impossible to perform some tasks, really impedes some aspect of your life. So a disability just means that you can overcome it as a function of having some means, and a handicap is really occurs when there's no way to overcome it because the physical or social environment doesn't allow you to. And a person can be disabled in one context and handicapped in another, depending on the context of their experience. So there's some buildings people could find themselves being disabled in, and some buildings they're actually handicapped in. One of the examples the book talks about is, and if you start reframing this, the example is, imagine a building that there's no elevators, no stairs. Instead, there's a rope, and you have to climb up this rope to get to the floor you're on. In this context, most people would find themselves being quite disabled or handicapped because they cannot overcome the limitations of the design of the physical environment. Not a lot of people can just straight climb a rope to 5 stories high without falling and hurting themselves. So really, we shouldn't think of disability as something intrinsic to the person, but really something about the interaction between the person and their physical and social environment. And that what we can do is think about the way we are designing our physical and social environment to make it more accessible, right? We wouldn't design buildings with ropes instead of stairs and elevators. Likewise, we can always make design decisions and make things easier for all the people. So again, disability is not something about a person. It's something about the relationship between a person and the environment they're in. And the physical environment is often easier to fix because it's more concrete. You can look around and see, oh yeah, these stairs are a problem and we need a ramp. The more insidious barrier is the social barrier, the textbook says, right? As the book says, these barriers are kind of a form of psychological disabling because too much value is placed on the ability of physical bodies, on things like physical attractiveness, and as a result, people feel socially disabled on top of, physically, which is much harder to correct. This often occurs simply because of uncertainty, which is in turn because we lack a lot of direct experience. Sometimes these kind of media portrayals of disability are the only experiences non-disabled people have had. Non-disabled, again in scare quotes, because it's really a function of context. Um, so, and I want to emphasize that when we're dealing with stereotypes, when we're dealing with media portrayals, negative or positive stereotypical depictions are both a problem. Even really positive portrayals can be a kind of prejudice. There's a great TED Talk that I put on FOL. It's called "I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much." This is Stella Young. She unfortunately passed away at the age of 32 of a sudden, really unexpected brain aneurysm, probably unrelated to her health problems. And in her TED Talk, Stella says, look, the portrayals of disabled people doing ordinary things or being athletic even is really a problem for me in a way, because then I become objectified. I become someone else's like inspiration, but I'm not inspirational to anyone. I'm just a human being. So she says, look, you may have seen images, the only disability in life is a bad attitude, and there's a picture of someone like with a disability doing something incredible. You might have seen a child running on carbon fiber prosthetic legs. These images, there are lots of them out there, they are what we call, and this is her terminology, they're what we call inspiration porn. And I use the term porn deliberately, quote, because they objectify one group of people for the benefit of another group of people. Objectification just kind of means treating somebody like an object, not like a person, that they're there for you to use. So in this case, we're objectifying disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. The purpose of these images is to inspire you, to motivate you, so that we can look at them and think, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse. I could be that person. But even though we're supposed to be inspired by disability, we should be cautious and critical of some of these images, because really we should just be thinking of people with disabilities as normal people, just having a specific kind of relationship to their environment, their social and physical environment. So when we're communicating across ability or across disability, right? Again, we should work through this discomfort, right? As the article says, look, people with disabilities have observed that non-disabled persons keep a greater physical distance. They avoid eye contact. They avoid mentioning the disability. They may cut the conversation short. They're just being awkward for no reason, right? And maybe we're doing our best not to show discomfort, but the outcome may be that the person with the disability perceives that some people don't want to be interacting with them. It becomes a handicap in the social environment. Right? So again, just if a situation like this occurs, just notice yourself doing it and see if you could correct it. So how do we do this? Well, there's a number of things. For the person, right, who say becomes disabled, and I'm going to keep using scare quotes here, there's a process, right, where they redefine themselves as part of this kind of new culture, where the person, and this is from the reading, incorporates disability into their identity, into their new life. Like, okay, I'm a person who has this now. And we should also, as a society, think about the idea that everyone requires adaptation and accommodations to survive. And we don't see common adaptation as adaptation, but it really is. Everybody is disabled relative to some physical or social context. So it really just becomes a matter of degree. Everybody's disabled relative to a building with no stairs, but only a rope. Right? We all need clothing to survive. Right? We all need shoes. Right? We all need adaptations. And this could help us finally redefine disability for the culture as a whole. So it's not just the concept of disability, but our views of it, right? That we change the view of people with disabilities as helpless or as victims or as sick, or as ill, and the kind of the paternalistic treatment or the uncomfortable treatment such a view brings. And I think really redefining the concept of disability is kind of the key move here, because once we just see each other, everyone, as having just different levels of adaptation, different types of adaptations relative to social and physical environment, right? That discomfort just, in a way, melts away because we're all on the same playing field. So, in terms of the actual do's and don'ts, what does the article say? It says, well, look, you should um, you should never just avoid communication because you're uncomfortable or unsure. Just act natural. Never assume that people with disabilities can't speak for themselves or do things for themselves. Like in the case of, was it Jonathan earlier in the reading, where the waiter was just like, well, clearly I'm going to talk. I can't talk to you. You're in a wheelchair. Who knows? So never do that. Never assume that people with disabilities are not autonomous human beings. Right? Don't force your help on people with disabilities. Try to avoid terms like handicapped, crippled, victim. Obviously don't, right? You can always ask people what they think of terms like that. Like, I know that um, different people who have, for example, really different views on a term like dwarf, and that really depends on the person. And of course, never assume a disability really defines who a person is, because it doesn't. Much like, and again, I think the cultural metaphor here is really good, because we've talked again and again that culture doesn't define the individual person. Just because you're from somewhere doesn't mean you have all the stereotypical associations with that culture. Just because you're from Quebec doesn't mean you like poutine, although I love poutine, it's true. Um, right, so we never assume culture, ethnicity, religion, or ability, disability defines who a person actually is. We always have to encounter the individual. So what should we do? Um, well, just remember, people with disabilities have lots of experience in dealing with awkward social circumstances. They know you might be uncomfortable. They understand how you might be feeling. So you don't need to be awkward, right? Um, and always just assume they're autonomous human beings. Assume they can do it until and unless they said otherwise. Let people with disabilities tell you if they want something, what they want, and when and if they want it, right? Don't help someone that's not asking for help, right? Um, and we're going to use terms like people with disabilities, right? Because we're going to stress the person first, right? To kind of sum it up, right? And this quote is kind of the big take home for the article, right? Treat people with disabilities as people first, right? So seek the humanity of the person with whom you're speaking, focus on their individual characteristics, right? Don't diminish the significance of a person's physical ability slash disability, but make a real effort to focus on the many other aspects of the person as you communicate. And then you can just kind of make that transition from discomfort and awkward, oh gosh, I don't know, to like, oh, here's this human being that I'm talking to, and this common humanity is really important. So that's this article. The chat box is pretty quiet right now. I mean, on a really personal note, if I may, um, my eldest daughter has a very mild sort of dyskinetic cerebral palsy. Now, cerebral palsy, of course, can result in like motor function and executive function issues, coordination, balance, fine motor skills. So you might have your hands shake, or you might jerk around a little bit. And though she has a very, very mild diagnosis, a very mild case, there are limits to her own physical ability that I often just completely forget about. Um, and the idea that people would treat her differently makes me a little bit sad sometimes. And we've worked around it pretty well to the extent that I have completely forgotten about um, or rather, I don't think of her as somebody with a disability. I just think of her as having abilities, and that's all relative to the context. So I don't know. This reading really spoke to me as a parent of a child with a mild disability. And even if you're not in the chat box, I hope that reading it or going over it kind of made you think of people in your lives, or maybe yourself, if you struggle, if you know you have ever been challenged in your life in this way, whether it's a physical thing, a mental thing, that you're not disabled, you're very abled, and it's all about that relationship to the physical and social environment. All right, that's all I wanted to say about that. Um, Let me just work through quickly this nice article from the Harvard Business Review, great magazine, great site, called "The Case for Improving Work for People with Disabilities." I think it gets the article from the book was a little abstract. This one, because it's geared at kind of business people, is a little bit more practical, a little bit has a lot of good research in it. So I think it's a nice supplement to the book's article. So the case for improving work for people with disabilities goes way beyond compliance. Compliance, of course, is compliance with the ADA. That's the American with Disabilities Act. So it's not just that you have a legal mandate to do so, it just makes sense. So according to this study here, up to a third of the white-collar workforce has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. 30% of this survey of 3,570 people. Major life activities, that's a kind of that's a definition in the literature. If you remember from the reading, they actually define those, right? You have mobility, right? Kind of the one you think of, like somebody in a wheelchair has, right? Mobility would be an example here. Employment, self-care, social relationships, communication, right? So up to 30%. However, the article notes people with disabilities can contribute to an organization just as much, if not more, often because of cultural diversity. You can actually, there's a link here, and I have the research a few slides in the future, but there's a lot of research suggesting that diversity of all kinds actually is strongly correlated with innovation and creativity. Diverse teams do better as a result of their increased creativity and innovation. I have that article. It's coming up in the second half of this course here. Let's just focus on this one. The article says, look, many people are surprised to learn that there's such a high rate of people, but you have to remember there's a difference between the kind of stereotypical image of disability we have, which is, for example, a wheelchair, right? But close to 2/3 of the study's respondents have an invisible disability, right? Diseases like lupus, Crohn's, right? Where usually you're fine, but you can have this flare up, which means that it gets bad some days and then it's just incapacitating, right? Migraines, mood disorders, depression, learning disabilities, dyslexia, right? Neurodiversity like autism, right? So you have a lot of things that are sometimes invisible. You just can't see it. So how do we remove the challenges faced by people with disabilities? How do we open up innovative opportunities by having more diverse teams? Well, we could ensure everyone on team actually gets heard. Right? So we make sure that if the diversity in a team situation will only be leveraged if everybody actually has a chance to get heard and to speak. When you give actionable, useful feedback, when you empower team members to make decisions, you make it safe to propose novel ideas, that's how you leverage the diversity of your group into actual innovation. And again, there's a lot of very solid research suggesting that if you do these things, diversity makes teams better. Less prone to biases, less prone to what we call groupthink, which is when homogeneous groups don't allow outside information in and as a result can make disastrous decisions. So, how can organizations improve their workplace for the up to, again, up to a third of people with various sorts of disability. Um, so these are quotes from the article, right? You should provide training, right? Many new employees with disabilities need support, but the colleagues and managers may not know how to help them. So it's not about just helping individuals with disabilities in your workplace, but making sure managers and colleagues are up to speed as well. Offer leadership development opportunities to employees with disabilities, right? Unconscious bias can cause managers to overlook people with disabilities for leadership programs. So people might not think they're consciously biased, but there's a lot of empirical research, a lot of research in psychology suggesting there are forms of unconscious bias that might lead us to make decisions without even being aware of it, um, that discriminate. Provide role models, right? Having a prominent executive with a disability makes it easier for others to see themselves in leadership positions, right? So having seen those role models can be really important as well, because you know that it's possible. Um, I mean, I'm an old guy. I'm going to turn 41 next week, and I I go rock climbing a lot. This is kind of an example from my personal life, and it means everything to me when I'm at the gym. It's closed right now, but I see like a 50-year-old guy like really climbing hard, and I'm like, that means I can do it too, right? You know, so seeing the role model and knowing that it's possible, is really important. And of course, creating allies in the organization, encourage employees to speak up, show their sympathy, right? So if you feel like you're alone, you're ostracized, you feel like you're always the person complaining about, oh gosh, these stairs are not accessible, right? The elevator's like this. If nobody's your ally in this fight, it's going to be really hard. It's going to be a lot harder to feel like you can do anything about it, feel like you can change your organization. So creating allies is really important. Last night, I watched this Brooklyn Nine-Nine episode, and it's from season 6. It's called He Said, She Said, and it's about it's a comedy show, right? Brooklyn Nine-Nine's a sitcom, but it's about a sexual harassment case in the workplace that they investigate. And I think everybody should go on Netflix, watch that episode. It's not about ability or disability, but it's about creating allyship um, and challenging structural injustice. So just watch it. It's a really great episode of television. Brooklyn Nine-Nine episode He Said, She Said. Go watch it. Okay. Advance happy birthday. Thank you, Justina. Yes, I turned 41 April 6th. So, um, funnily enough, the word quarantine is in French and Italian, that means une quarantaine is 40-ish. So 40 is a quarantine is supposed because you're supposed to be like by yourself for 40 days. They used to quarantine ships for 40 days in Italian ports. And I'm turning 41, so I'm going to be spending my 40s in quarantaine in the 40 teens. That's a pun having to do with Latin etymology. Forget it. It's let's just keep going with the class. Um, so earlier I said that diverse teams work better. And in this section, I'm going to talk a little bit about what team development looks like, what leadership in a team context looks like, and give you some tips and some kind of soft people skills in the context of team building. Now, of course, this content was designed and created back when the classroom had group projects, but of course, your group projects have been replaced with individual projects. Nevertheless, I do hope that this content is useful to you. The goal of a comm class is to develop soft skills as opposed to hard technical skills, soft skills in communication, not just writing, but all forms of interpersonal social interaction, which are really key to success in your workplace. So team development, intercultural communication skills are part of those soft skills. So in kind of like 4 distinct phases. So first you form the team in which you select your members, you become acquainted with each other, you build trust. And then once you've kind of like become acquainted with each other, you just start talking out your goals you start talking about how you want to proceed. And then in stage 3, norming, you make those decisions and you really start working. You start applying these criteria, you set up brainstorming, you figure out, you're putting it all together. And then the final stage, stage 4, you're performing, which is that you're no longer having discussions about what you want to do, you're just kind of doing it. You're not talking about how you want to do, you're just performing, you're just doing it. So you form the team, you brainstorm ideas, you apply these ideas, you start working on them, and then you just start performing as a team. And in every stage of team development, right, you're going to want to be asking yourself, am I going through these stages smoothly? Am I missing anything? Are we jumping over stuff? Are we trying to do too much at the same time? Are we trying to perform while we're still just brainstorming? So keeping these distinct and being conscious of where you are in your team building is really critical to having a successful team. So in the first step, right, that's the kind of get to know each other step. You establish a group dynamic, right? In the first couple steps, really, you have lots of pitfalls to avoid. And part of being a leader in a team context is to know what these pitfalls are in team development and making sure that you avoid them, right? For example, right, even if there's someone officially in charge, you might just find yourself with personalities that talk more, that really dominate decision making, and as a result, not everybody in the group gets heard. So a good leader isn't the person that talks the most. A good leader isn't the person who makes all the decisions, necessarily. A good leader really is more like a traffic cop, right? They make sure there's smooth cooperation between team members. They make sure that everybody's getting heard. They make sure that all contributions are being valued. Right? The credit is given where it's due. So there's going to be a temptation to kind of rush through and just go straight to performing, but really you need to take time to form your group and to establish this group dynamic. When you're in the brainstorming phase, this is when, as a group, you get together and you start setting your goals and discussing like what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. It's normal that there's a little bit of conflict. What you want is the good kind of conflict, not the bad kind of conflict. Right? The bad kind of conflict is hostile, right? Where people aren't giving constructive criticism, but they're closer to insulting each other, like, oh, that's a ridiculous idea. So you don't want hostile conflict. You don't want a deadlock either, where you're making no progress. You don't want to feel stressful about your conflict. You want your conflict to be productive. A couple of weeks ago, I feel probably a month ago now, we talked about the difference in conflict resolution strategies between individualists and collectivists. Now, if this was a regular in-person classroom, what I would do is I would just stop and like ask people to raise their hands and tell me what they remember about individual and collective styles of conflict management. Let me just recap it for you because I think it's really important here. Brainstorming is when you might deal with the most conflict. The individualistic approach to conflict resolution is direct. You tell somebody directly, I don't agree, and you give them useful reasons why, and you propose an alternative. And that's supposed to be fine in an individualist context. For some cultures where there's more of a collective approach to problem solving, you can't do this. What you're supposed to do is beforehand figure out what people are thinking, build some coalitions, build some allies, use intermediaries to smooth conflict over so that when everybody gets together, everybody's already on the same page because the conflict has been sort of dealt with beforehand. And if more conflict arises, right, you have to make sure people have an opportunity to save face so they don't look bad in front of other people. You're supposed to deal with it outside, maybe in a different context. You're supposed to be a little bit more diplomatic so that group harmony isn't destabilized by direct confrontation. And I don't believe, having read a lot about this for this class, that one strategy is necessarily better than the others in all contexts. The question is whether or not you are consciously approaching the idea and possibility of conflict in such a way that it's productive rather than not productive. And that if there's conflict about conflict, and what I mean by that is there is disagreement about how to handle conflict, because some people are more direct, some people are more indirect. that you're able to identify that this is happening and say, ah, I see why we are deadlocked. I see why this feels stressful. Person A wants to deal with the problem directly. Person B wants to be indirect. How can I stop this dynamic, this non-productive dynamic, and turn it into something else? That's what a good leader would do. They would figure that problem out. An important part of, how am I doing here? Shalom. An important part also of the brainstorming and norming, steps 2, step 3, is figuring out how you're going to be deciding stuff. In small groups, of course, you might just talk it out and things will work out. In more formal context for larger groups, you might just be explicit about how you're going to be making your decisions, right? You could just go majority rule. So I have a survey online on FOL right now, and the survey is asking you, what do you think about YouTube? How do you feel about Bongo Virtual Classroom? Which one do you want to use? And I'm going to look at those poll results, and that's going to be a majority rule, I'm pretty sure, because I'm just going to see what students want and do it. I'm not going to go for authority rule, which is just me deciding, although I could. I could just decide how we're going to do this. But I kind of decided how we're going to decide. You can be consensus, right? Everybody has to agree. A minority report is where you ask somebody, hey, I need you to do the research on this and come up with a recommendation, and your recommendation is what we're going to do. So there's lots of different ways of deciding. So again, if you notice that you're stalled in your group with non-productive conflict, maybe the problem is that you haven't decided how to decide. A fun little philosophical paradox here. If you haven't decided how to decide, how are you going to decide how to decide? Think about it. Let's skip some slides here, just because I want to keep this under an hour. Very quickly, let's talk about step 3 and step 4 here. So, right, you form a group, you establish a useful group dynamic, right? You start brainstorming, you start coming up with ideas or conflict, but you can deal with conflict. You know how you're making decisions. Then you start norming and performing. In the norming phase is when you first implement the ideas of the brainstorming phase consciously, right? You figure out what goals you want to try out, how you're going to be measuring them. You provide some feedback, right? You're starting to make progress. And this leads you naturally to the 4th stage, performing, where you're no longer talking about what you should do and you're just kind of doing it. You have a shared set of expectations, you've established practices, you don't need a meeting every week, you don't need a lot of supervision. Everybody's more autonomous and they're able to just perform as a group without talking about the fact that they're in a group. So performing is kind of like where you want to end up as a group. So how do you do this? Use Twitch so we can donate. Well, vote for Twitch. Yeah, I was thinking about Twitch. Maybe I'll live stream Untitled Goose Game for you guys. So how do you make teams work? How do you make sure, how do you deal with conflict? How do you deal with decision-making procedures? How do you get to that stage 4 where you're just performing? So let me talk a little bit about team problems and team roles. So common team problems include confusion, right? People just don't know what they're supposed to do. People are working at cross purposes, right? They're both working on the same. I've had, a few years ago, I had a presentation where students worked separately, put their presentation together at the end, and two of the people in the group ended up working on the same section. So I had the same section appear twice, and as they were presenting, it just kind of dawned on them like, oh my gosh, we have duplicate work here, and the presentation went over time. So there was a failure of team communication there, right? There could be bad leadership in an organization. Sometimes there's no real commitment to teams, right? Not everybody gets the credit for teamwork. There could be poor feedback, right? There's a lack of performance metrics. You don't know if you're making progress. So these are all kind of team problems that can occur. And how do you deal with these problems? Use Twitch. So Twitch is having some popularity here. Again, just go and vote. Majority rule. So there's this great article that a colleague of mine recommended to me for this specific section of the course. It's called Functional Roles of Group Members by psychologists K. Benny P. Sheets. The Benny Sheets Group Roles Inventory, very famous. Um, what the authors do in this piece of psychology is present 26 different roles that group members can play in a team context. Now, don't misunderstand this as like a personality type inventory. This is not has nothing to do with personality type. It's a description of roles that you can perform. Think about it like if you ever played a video game where there's a team, right? There's often different roles in the video game, right? I understand there's a role called the tank, and the tank is the one that absorbs all the damage, right? There's the healer, so on, right? Functional roles that you can perform. So the idea here is, look, that you should be thinking about your team at work, at school, in a similar way. You need to have the right roles at the right time. And again, I'm talking about leadership in the context of teamwork. A good leader doesn't just direct traffic, make sure credit it's given where it's due, doesn't make sure just make sure that everybody gets heard. They also do this more sophisticated thing, which is recruit functional roles, recruit social roles, and discourages dysfunctional roles. What do I mean by that? Well, functional roles, Benny and Sheets say, are kind of divided into two sorts, task and social. Task roles in a group are related to accomplishing tasks. Social roles are related to the kind of social aspects of working in a team, and both are really important. And finally, we have dysfunctional roles. Dysfunction means is like bad function, and you want to discourage those. You don't want dysfunction in your group because that makes your group less productive. So here's some of there's lots of these roles. I'm not going to talk about all of them in detail. However, right, so you might need to recruit if you want to be a good leader, an effective leader. It's not about doing everything. It's about figuring out who should be doing what at the right time, right? So, right, I love, for example, in my classrooms having somebody who's the initiator. It's a really important task role, right? The first person to talk is really useful. You propose an original idea. It doesn't matter if it's vague. It doesn't matter if it's a bad idea. As long as you get the ball rolling, right, then you're playing an important role. If you've ever been, I used to go to bars a lot in my 20s, and the initiator was a very important role in my friends group, right? Who's going to be the first person to go to the dance floor, right? You never want to be the first person to dance if no one else is, but it's really easy to be the 10th person if the dance floor is crowded because you feel like nobody's paying attention to you. So the initiator, the person that puts themselves out there first, really important task role, right? Other task roles include people who seek information, people who give information, people who look for opinions, who give their opinions. The elaborator, that's a useful role too. The elaborator can take the initiator's ideas, then it might be vague, it might be like, hey, maybe we could do something like this, and then says, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's build on them with examples, facts, data. So if you have a lot of initiators in your group, as a leader, you might think, I need to find an elaborator. Who hasn't spoken yet? Who's the kind of person that's detail-oriented? You over there. What do you make of this idea? How can we make it more concrete, more detailed? So you recruit those roles so that your group is functional. Have a look at those. So these slides are online, of course. Have a look at these task roles and think of situations where you might need to, again, recruit. Say, okay, we need to be oriented to our task. We've lost the overall plot here. We need a critic here because we're not actually being sufficiently critical of ourselves, right? This kind of thing. Moving from task roles to social roles, here's other things that are pretty important, right? We have things like the encourager, which is just the person that affirms, supports, praises the efforts, and encourager is really useful, right? Demonstrates a positive attitude in meetings, right? The person that stops and says, hey, that's a really good idea, right? That can help keep the group moving forward. The harmonizer, another important social role, right? Seeks ways to reduce tension, find solutions, right? And social roles. There's a bunch of these. Compromiser. Okay, let me move on to the dysfunctional roles because it's 12:55 and I want to keep this to roughly an hour because who has time to listen to me for 2 hours? The dysfunctional roles are things we might be really familiar with in our classroom environments, in our work lives, right? Anytime you've had to work in a team, you might have seen these roles, and they can really make productivity grind to a halt, right? Um, there's dysfunction like the aggressor, right? Who is critical, but just is critical in a non-constructive way. They will use insulting comments. It's the most ridiculous idea I've ever heard, but they don't propose an alternative, and they don't say why. Now, often the aggressor is present because they're attempting to decrease another member's status to increase their own. We need to put a stop on that. The American playwright Tennessee Williams once wrote in one of his plays that all cruel people describe themselves as paragons of frankness. Right? So the aggressor might try to hide behind, like, I'm just telling it how it is. I'm just being honest. Nobody's honest out here except me. But if their honesty is just a facade for cruelty and an attempt to raise their status without actually being constructive, your job as a leader is to smash that. Stop them. Either turn that critical energy to something useful or just tell them to zip it. The blocker just opposes things. Recognition seeker only draws personal attention to themselves, right? The self-confessor, that's my problem, uses the group meetings as an avenue to disclose personal feelings, to talk about their views on issues. As a professor, this has always been my problem. I just want to talk about myself, what video games I'm playing. So that's my dysfunction. The disruptor uses group meetings as a fun time to get out of real work. Let's tell some jokes. Let's do hashtag fragging in the chat box. So, just kidding, Noah. The dominator tries to control the conversation, right? So these are all dysfunctional roles that, as a leader, you need to find ways to discourage, right? So your job is, right? Again, a leader is not just whoever is talking the loudest, has the biggest shoulders, and is able to like give an inspirational speech. The leader might even be talking the least, right? But what they're doing is ensuring the group is productive by figuring out how to deal with conflict, figuring out how to make decisions, and figuring out what roles you need and what roles you need to get rid of. Okay, so I've talked about this already, right? You're asking yourself, what roles do I need? How do I get them? How do I get rid of the dysfunctional ones? When do I need to reevaluate the group needs and roles, right? These are all questions leaders ask themselves. All right, there's a little comic here. Why don't we skip that? Let me talk about a couple small things as we wrap up here. Because we're closing in on 1 hour. And again, if you have any questions about the material, you're not sure about your research report or anything like that, I'm watching this chat box. I'm getting lots of emails I need to respond to, but please let me know if there's anything I could do for you out there. I have my guitars over here. I can play you some Smashing Pumpkins tunes. Okay. Successful teams, right? So as we were saying during the reading on disability, and there's a lot of evidence that diverse groups are more successful. Diversity makes teams better. And there's a lot of evidence for this. So let me click on this link here. This is an article from Scientific American. It's called How Diversity Makes Us Smarter. Being around people who are different makes us more creative, more diligent, and harder working. All right. You can read this article, and I really suggest you do if you're interested in this issue here. Because in brief, they say, look, we have decades of research by lots of different scientists, organizational scientists, psychologists, sociologists, economists, demographers, socially diverse groups, not just intellectual diversity, right? Not just, oh, we have some engineers and we have some chemists and we have some physicists and, oh, look at the diversity. But diversity across different axes. I'm talking race, ethnicity, gender, ability, disability, sexual orientation, religion, generational diversity. Right? The research shows that diversity creates innovation. They're more innovative than homogeneous groups. Homogeneous just means similar. The second point here is, right, it seems obvious that a group of people with diverse individual expertise, and that's the kind of diversity I was talking about before, right? Oh, here's an engineer, here's a humanities grad, here's a doctor. Yeah, it seems obvious a group of people with different individual expertise would be better than a homogeneous group at solving complex, non-routine problems. It is less obvious that social diversity, right, what we're talking about in this class, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, it seems less obvious that social diversity should work in the same way, but science shows it does. This is not only because people with different backgrounds bring new information, but simply interacting with individuals who are different, right, between different groups forces group members to prepare better, to anticipate alternative viewpoints, to expect that reaching consensus and making decisions will take effort. So you're not taking your decision making and your information gathering for granted anymore. This is a really great article, right? And I really suggest you read it. The link is there in the slides. Ode to Joy, Noah says. I should play the Ode to Joy? All right. Yeah, I might actually. So let's look at how to apply some people skills. Here's some soft skills here, now that I've talked about diversity. And I'm going to close on that, and I'm going to send you off with the Ode to Joy. Here's another link that I think is actually really nice. It's about critical feedback. So one of the things you might have to do, because I'm talking about leadership and teamwork, one of the important things a leader should do is give feedback to the team members. How do you give feedback? So often we have this image of the leader being critical, right? We have somebody who's hard-nosed and realistic and giving you tough love and telling you how it is. Unfortunately, or fortunately or unfortunately, all the research we have on performance suggests that this image we have of the tough, no-nonsense leader giving critical feedback doesn't actually get the job done. The answers take us in a really different direction. And all the research on what excellence is and how you get people to improve. Right? Being really negative and critical and focusing on errors and mistakes doesn't actually work, it turns out. And the authors of this piece, called The Feedback Fallacy, pull together a lot of contemporary research on learning, on expertise, and on feedback. And when you put all that stuff together, some really startling lessons occur for leaders who are interested in giving feedback to their team members. The first thing to remember is that learning happens, quote, when we see how we might do something better. We see how we might do something better by adding nuance or expansion to our existing understanding. In other words, learning rests on our grasp of what we're already doing really well, not on what we're doing poorly. Right? So by focusing on things we're very bad at, we freeze up, we get defensive, we get negative, and we just want to shut down. However, if we focus on where we're doing pretty good, and we suggest ways to improve those things, even the things we're not, it's not about doing really well or doing really poorly. So if there's something you're less good at, you can still focus on the good element of the thing you're less good at. So you can improve that area a little bit, right? Because learning rests on our grasp of what we're already doing pretty well. We learn most when somebody else pays attention to what's working and asks us to cultivate that, right? We're often told the key to learning is to get out of our comfort zones entirely, but the findings contradict that. Because if you take us too far of our comfort zones, our brains stop paying attention to anything other than just surviving the experience. So focusing on the negative causes us to shut down. Focusing on the positive, right, causes us to be more open to learning from the experience and, right, adding some nuance, some extra oomph to the thing we're doing. So, what should you do? Well, because being really excellent at something is fundamentally an outcome, we should observe it and take note of it. For example, when a prospect really is leaning into a sales pitch, when a project is going really smoothly, when the angry customer suddenly calms down, right? You're going to want to go to the team member, whoever created that outcome, and say, yeah, that was perfect. Right? You stop the flow of work for a moment, you pull your colleagues' attention towards something that they just did that really, really worked, and then they can improve on that. Right? So by drawing attention to what people do well and helping them do better at it, you'll help them expand their circle of knowledge without feeling defensive. I'm really trying to compress a fascinating long article. You can click on the link here. And it's one of the best things I've ever read on feedback. It really fundamentally changed who I am as a teacher, just reading this article. So I really want you to do that as well. It kind of reminds me, in fact, of this book here. Let me see if I could find the book. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So Thinking Fast and Slow is a book that kind of summarizes decades of scientific psychological research on biases in human thinking. Because we think of ourselves as really rational creatures, but we're only sort of rational. We have biases in our reasoning. And I think this is a really great book. So if you need something to read during quarantine, Thinking Fast and Slow is my book recommendation to you. But there's this great anecdote in the book. And so Kahneman is, I think he's instructing the Air Force, and he's trying to figure out why, what is the best way to train new recruits in the Air Force, the U.S. military. And the kind of sergeant or general or whoever's in charge of training them says, well, here's what I do. When the pilots do poorly and they don't perform very well, I shout at them and I tell them they did a bad job. And I never praise them, because when I shout at them when they do a bad job, they get better. When I praise them for doing a good job, they get worse. And Kahneman says, oh my gosh, this is a function of regression to the mean. What do I mean by that? Regression to the mean implies that you have an average performance. Pretend my hand here is the average performance. Regression to the mean suggests that, on average, if you perform below your baseline, next time you'll probably perform better because you have an average performance, and a bad performance is an outlier. It's an uncommon thing. Likewise, a really good performance is an outlier, and it's an uncommon thing, and you're going to go back to your average performance. So no matter what the general does, right, of course, if he shouts at people when they did bad, probably they're going to do better next time because they just would have otherwise. They would have returned to their average performance. All right? He says, of course, if you praise someone for doing really well, probably their next performance isn't going to be as well because they're going to go back to their average. So the question isn't really about that. It's about how can we take this average and push it upwards. And all the research suggests to push that performance upwards, you need to focus on what people did well to give an opportunity to develop the skill that they have so they can identify their areas of excellence and expand on them. All right, so that's what I wanted to say about feedback. And it's really, what a great article. Please read it. Here's another example of a soft skill from the Washington Post. All right, let me just read to you this quote. This is a quote where, again, it's about diversity. Diversity leads, we know this, to innovation and creative problem solving. But it only works if people are heard. So here's how, in the Obama administration, female staffers made sure that they were being heard so that this diversity would be useful. Let me just read this to you. When President Obama took office, 2/3 of his aides were men. Women complained of having to elbow their way into meetings. When they got in, they were sometimes ignored. So they adopted this meeting strategy they called amplification. When a woman made a key point, another woman would repeat it, giving credit to the author, forcing people in the room to recognize the contribution, who made it, so they couldn't claim the idea as their own. And I have absolutely seen this in real life myself. We just started doing it. It was an everyday thing, said one former Obama aide who requested anonymity to speak frankly. Obama noticed, began calling more often on women and junior aides. So this is how they amplified their contributions in order to kind of leverage this diversity that all the science says is really important for to get this kind of creative problem solving leverage out of diversity. So for dealing with conflict, finally, can be really hard, but here's another soft skill, right? As a leader, right, your job is not to just shut down conflict by shouting at people, right? You're supposed to deal with conflict by eventually reaching some kind of agreement that's fair. What you need, the first 3 steps are actually the most important because half the time conflict arises because people just want to be heard. Right? So you really need to listen and understand why conflict is occurring and show concern for people and the issues they're bringing up. Then you can pivot and start trying to solve the problem by looking for common ground, finding some options, and coming to a fair agreement. Right? But really, all the action happens here. Listen, understand, show concern. Right? If you're a parent, you know this is really important. Right? You need to come down to your kid's level, listen, understand, and show concern. Because again, people just want to have their emotions acknowledged. Okay, so that's my hour for today. It's an hour and 11 minutes. Noah, are you still around? Let me see if I can get the guitar down. So thanks for watching. And I'll see you next week. See you next week.